He sat by her coffin, trembling not with fear, but with something deeper. Max, the golden retriever who had never barked without reason, suddenly howled loud and broken. The church fell silent. Then came the second bark from Rex, the German shepherd, and in that haunting echo, one truth became clear: whatever lay inside that casket wasn't resting in peace. Chapter 1. A Strange Farewell. The town of Greenhill, nestled among the soft hills and maple-lined roads of rural Virginia, woke that morning under a sky the color of ash. A thin mist clung to the air like a whispered prayer. The drizzle was light but constant, soaking the earth and the edges of every roof. The streets were unusually quiet save for the slow procession of black umbrellas moving toward the heart of the town, St. Peter's Church. Greenhill was not a place of great drama. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names, where the diners still served homemade pie, and where kindness was as common as the morning dew. But today the town gathered in grief, hearts heavy, to bid farewell to a woman who had been the soul of that kindness. Margaret Sullivan, 72 years old, had passed in her sleep just 3 nights before. She had been a gentle soul, thin and graceful, even in old age, her silver hair always tied into a bun that smelled faintly of lavender. Her face, though lined by time, bore the softness of someone who had spent her life listening more than speaking. Margaret had lived alone since her husband died decades earlier, but she was never truly alone. She had her garden, her books, her piano, and her dog Max. Max was a 4-year-old golden retriever with a thick, honey-colored coat and deep brown eyes that held the calm loyalty of a seasoned friend. To the townspeople, Max was more than a pet. He was Margaret's shadow, her companion on morning walks, her silent confidant. He greeted children with tail wags and strangers with cautious curiosity. Since Margaret's passing, Max had been quiet, refusing to eat much, spending hours lying near her favorite chair. Among the mourners was James Sullivan, Margaret's only grandson. James was 32, tall and lean, with unruly sandy blonde hair, soft hazel eyes, and the quiet demeanor of a man more comfortable in thought than in conversation. He had grown up in Greenhill under Margaret's care after losing both his parents in a car accident when he was 10. She had raised him with gentle firmness, teaching him to read poetry, respect the land, and speak kindly. Now her loss felt like losing the last piece of his foundation. James sat in the front row of the church pews, his black suit a little too large, his posture a little too rigid. Max lay obediently at his feet, his head resting on his paws. The old dog seemed to watch the coffin with a stillness that bordered on reverence. Around them the church filled slowly. Quiet sobs mixed with the soft creak of wooden pews. Father Thomas stood at the pulpit, his robes dark and formal. He was a man of 58 tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and slicked back salt and pepper hair. His face carried a certain austerity, dignified, perhaps even cold to those who didn't know him well. He had served at St. Peter's for over 20 years and was respected, though not particularly loved. There was a formality to him, a stiffness that made his kindness seem rehearsed. He began the service with a prayer, his voice deep and practiced. The congregation bowed their heads. The air inside was warm but heavy with emotion. Outside, the rain continued its patient tapping against the stained glass windows. Midway through Father Thomas's eulogy, a sharp bark broke the silence. It came from Max. He rose suddenly, his ears, alert eyes fixed on the coffin. A low growl followed. Then another bark, louder, urgent. A ripple of gasps passed through the room. James turned to Max, whispering, "Easy, boy," trying to place a calming hand on his back. Max didn't move. His body was tense, his bark rising again, this time echoing through the nave like a warning. A moment later, another bark joined in. It was Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd, sitting quietly a few rows back beside his owner, Jim Parker. Jim was the local carpenter, a man in his early 60s, stocky with sun-leathered skin and hands calloused from years of honest work. Rex, well-trained and disciplined, had never misbehaved in public. Yet now he stood, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on the same spot Max was barking at. Jim tried to hush him. "What is it, boy? What's gotten into you?" But Rex wouldn't stop. He growled low, protective. Father Thomas paused mid-sentence. His hands clenched the sides of the podium. He looked at Max, then at Rex, and then briefly at the coffin. Something unreadable passed across his face. He cleared his throat. "It's all right, folks. Dogs sense grief more than we do. Let's continue." But the dogs wouldn't stop. Max stepped closer to the coffin, barking louder, tail stiff, his hackles slightly raised. James stood pulling gently on Max's collar, his voice hushed but firm. "Stop, Max. Not here." The congregation stirred uncomfortably. Mary Walters, Margaret's neighbor for over 40 years, leaned toward another woman and whispered, "Dogs don't bark like that unless something's truly wrong." Mary was 79, a small woman with silver curls and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She had been Margaret's closest friend, and though her steps had slowed over the years, her mind was quick as ever. Her instincts sharpened by a lifetime of watching people flared with suspicion. Jim stood too, trying to get Rex under control, but Rex resisted, his growls growing deeper. Both dogs now stood staring at the casket, united in some silent alarm that no human could decipher. Father Thomas grew visibly tense. A sheen of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool air. He adjusted his robe. "Please, someone remove the dogs." James looked around helplessly, then knelt beside Max, whispering into his fur. "What is it, buddy? What do you see?" Max finally stopped barking but didn't relax. His body remained stiff, eyes never leaving the coffin. James stood again and looked around the church. He saw the confusion, the unease, the flicker of doubt forming in people's eyes. Something was wrong. He felt it. He couldn't name it yet, but Max had never acted this way. Father Thomas resumed speaking, but his voice had lost its earlier calm. It now trembled faintly, each word slightly rushed. His gaze rarely met the casket. Outside, the drizzle softened to a mist. Inside, the room grew colder. The service ended in subdued confusion. Some left whispering, others lingered glancing between the dogs and the coffin. Max and Rex, now silent, sat with eyes fixed on the same point as before. James looked down at Max. "We'll figure this out," he murmured. "I promise." And in that moment, under the dim light of stained glass and the weight of unspoken truths, a quiet thread of mystery began to unravel. Chapter 2. Rising Doubt. The following morning in Green Hill dawned quiet but restless, the rain having eased into a mist that clung to the treetops like forgotten breath. The streets were still wet from the night before, and the town, though back to its daily rhythms, pulsed with a subtle tension. James Sullivan had not slept well. He kept seeing Max's bark, not just hearing it, but feeling it like something deep had been stirred in the dog, something ancient and undeniable. Max lay curled on the rug by the fireplace, watching James with eyes too alert for a dog who should be grieving quietly. James sat at the old wooden table in Margaret's kitchen, the one she had polished with lemon oil every Saturday for years. The air still smelled faintly of her favorite tea. His fingers traced the rim of a cold coffee mug. The funeral was over, but something inside him couldn't let it go. Margaret's death had been declared natural, peaceful even, but the dog's behavior suggested otherwise. And the way Father Thomas had reacted, stiff and evasive, stuck in James's mind like a splinter. He reached for the yellow notepad Margaret always kept beside the phone and started writing. A habit she had passed on to him. "If it bothers you, write it down." So he wrote, "Max barked at the coffin. Rex did too." Father Thomas looked nervous. "Why?" He tapped the pen against the page, then added, "Margaret never trusted Thomas. Said he smiled without warmth." Max stirred, ears twitching. James looked at him. "Do you know something I don't, buddy?" Outside, the gate creaked. James turned to the window just as a familiar figure appeared at the garden path. Mary Walters walked slowly but purposefully, her cane tapping on the stone walkway. She was bundled in a moss-green shawl, her white curls peeking out from a knitted cap. Mary had always carried an air of quiet strength, the kind that came from enduring time and loss without hardening. James opened the door before she could knock. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she replied. Her voice was raspy, worn from age, but clear. "Mind if I come in?" He stepped aside, and she entered without waiting. Mary sat in Margaret's favorite chair, her eyes scanning the room with a familiarity that came from decades of friendship. She looked at Max, then back at James. "That dog saw something. So did Rex. And I don't think we should ignore it." James nodded slowly. "You saw Father Thomas yesterday." He wasn't just surprised. He looked guilty. Mary pressed her lips together. "Exactly. And when I mentioned Margaret to him a week ago, he changed the subject. Fast. Like he didn't want to talk about her at all." James hesitated. "Do you think she died naturally?" Mary looked out the window for a long moment. "I used to. But now, I'm not sure." They sat in silence until Max suddenly stood walking to the back door. He barked once, short, sharp. James opened the door and Max ran into the yard, sniffing the air with sudden intensity. "What's he found?" Mary asked. James followed Max to the tool shed. The dog circled it, growling, low, tail stiff. James unlocked the door and stepped inside. Nothing looked disturbed, just Margaret's old gardening gloves, some tools, sacks of seed. But Max sniffed one corner obsessively. James crouched and noticed a faint indentation in the dirt floor, barely visible, as if something had once been buried there. He dug with his hands until he found a small metal box wrapped in cloth. Inside were old photographs, a folded letter, and a silver locket. James opened the letter. It was in Margaret's handwriting. "If anything ever happens to me and you suspect foul play, this may help you understand. Trust Max. He always knows." His breath caught. Mary read over his shoulder. She was afraid. She knew. James looked again at the photos. Some were of Father Thomas in places he didn't expect to see him, at the edge of the woods behind the church, meeting with unfamiliar people. In one, Margaret stood in the background, unnoticed. Back in the house, James spread everything on the table. He pulled out his phone and searched the town archives online, specifically looking for any news involving Father Thomas. He found an article from years ago reporting a financial discrepancy in church donations. It had been quietly dismissed. Mary rubbed her temple. "I don't like this. If Margaret was digging into something and she thought she was in danger, then someone might have wanted her quiet." James nodded grimly. "And Father Thomas made sure she was alone when she died." Later that day, James took Max for a walk past the church. The dog became alert again near the back fence where wild ivy grew thick. He sniffed a patch of earth, then barked softly. James took note. As he turned to leave, a voice called behind him, "Mr. Sullivan!" It was Rebecca Clay, the church secretary. She was in her mid-40s, petite, with chestnut hair in a tight bun, and a nervous way of holding her clipboard to her chest. She'd always been polite but distant, the kind of person who followed rules strictly and avoided conflict. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, glancing around. "I wanted to tell you something, but not inside the church." James raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Rebecca lowered her voice. "Father Thomas has been acting strange for weeks, locking the office at odd hours. He yelled at me last Thursday for asking about an old account, said it was none of my business." James's pulse quickened. "Do you know what account it was?" She shook her head. "Just something labeled Special Fund. It didn't look like church repairs or charity. And there were deposits, large ones, from names I didn't recognize." James thanked her and she left quickly, checking over her shoulder. He stood there a while, Max pressed against his leg, the rain starting to fall again. That night, James couldn't sleep. He laid the photograph's letter and locket out in front of him. One of the photos had something he hadn't noticed before, a timestamp in the bottom corner. The date matched the day before Margaret died. The next morning, James and Mary met again. "We need to find out more," he said. I'm going to talk to the librarian, see if she knows about this special fund. Maybe there's a record Father Thomas forgot to cover up." Mary nodded. "I'll talk to Jim. He knows people. And Rex may remember something too." As they parted, James glanced down at Max. The dog looked up at him with eyes that seemed to understand far more than they should. "All right, partner," James murmured. "Let's get to work." Chapter 3. The Unfolding Path. The late afternoon sun stretched long fingers of golden light across the rooftops of Green Hill as James made his way back to Margaret's old house, Max trotting quietly beside him. The breeze carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke, peaceful and nostalgic. But James's mind was anything but calm. Clutched under his arm was the small metal box he had unearthed from the garden, the one that hinted at something Margaret feared, something tied to Father Thomas. And now, with Rebecca's warning about the special fund echoing in his mind, James knew there was more waiting to be uncovered. Inside the house was quiet. Dust hung in slanted light as if time had paused here out of respect. James gently placed the box on the living room table and knelt to open the low drawer beneath the bookshelf. It was filled with stacks of paper, Margaret's journals, receipts, old birthday cards, and letters bundled with twine. Max lay beside him, ears perked, while Rex sat attentively at the doorway, having followed with Jim's quiet approval. The German Shepherd was protective, intelligent, and always alert. He had a dark saddle pattern across his back, and though he rarely barked without cause today, he remained still, watching every movement. James carefully unwrapped a bundle labeled Private MS. Inside were handwritten letters, most addressed to a name he hadn't heard in years, Eleanor Grayson. A retired schoolteacher who had moved away over a decade ago, Eleanor had been Margaret's closest friend before Mary. James vaguely remembered her as a tall, graceful woman in her 70s with a soft southern drawl and an ever-present silver locket. The letters were filled with worry. Margaret confided suspicions that the church funds were being misused, that certain community donations were disappearing without record. She had mentioned confronting Father Thomas once and receiving only vague reassurances. James kept reading each page, heavier than the last. One letter stood out. It referenced a hidden ledger Margaret had once seen tucked away in the back of the church vestry during a meeting. The letter ended with, "If anything ever happens, tell Eleanor. She'll know what to do." Max gave a small whine and nudged James's arm. He glanced up and followed Max's gaze to the wall, specifically to the piano. It had been Margaret's pride, its top often cluttered with framed photos and sheet music. James rose and slowly lifted the lid. No music inside, just old bills. But beneath the bench was a narrow wooden drawer. He slid it open and inside found another envelope, dusty and sealed with red wax. Breaking it open, he found photographs newer than the rest and a church financial log clearly marked restricted access. James's breath caught as he flipped through it. Page after page of large donations with no explanation. Many came from names James didn't recognize. Some weren't even local, but one stood out: H. Whitmore. Henry Whitmore had been the largest landowner in Green Hill until he died mysteriously 5 years ago. Margaret's notes in the margin read, "Money moved just before his death. No family ever claimed it." A floorboard creaked. James turned sharply. Mary was standing in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl, her eyes sharp. "You left the gate open," she said softly. And Rex followed. "I assumed that meant something was happening." James gave her a tired nod. "You were right. Margaret was tracking something big. These aren't just suspicions anymore. They're proof." Mary stepped inside, gazing over the letters and ledgers. Her hands trembled as she picked up a photograph. This was taken in the old meeting hall behind the church. But that building's been closed for years. She believed Father Thomas was using it to meet with people, James said, possibly laundering donations or moving money through dummy accounts. Mary's lips tightened. "And now he's trying to bury every trace." At that moment, Rex let out a low growl. Max stood too, his body tense. James rushed to the window and peeked through the curtain. Across the street, Father Thomas stood beside his car speaking on the phone. He paced anxiously, gesturing toward the house. "He's watching us," James muttered. "He knows you found something," Mary added. "Then we need to move fast." James packed the documents and photos into a satchel and turned to Mary. "We need someone else who might know about this. Someone Margaret trusted besides you. Do you remember Eleanor Grayson?" Mary nodded slowly. "She moved to Blue Ridge County after her husband passed. I have her address in my diary. Then we're going there." That night, after securing the documents in his backpack, James lay awake on the couch. Max curled at his feet. Sleep didn't come easy. Shadows danced on the ceiling, and the ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than ever. His thoughts kept circling back to one question. What exactly had Margaret discovered that was worth silencing? The next morning, James set off with Max in the passenger seat and the satchel secured tightly beside him. Mary had promised to speak with Jim and quietly rally others in town who still respected Margaret's legacy. Rex stayed behind, reluctant, watching from the porch. The drive to Blue Ridge was long and winding, the hills opening up to stretches of farmland and pine forest. When they arrived at Eleanor Grayson's cottage, a tidy brick house with a wraparound porch, James felt a strange comfort. It was like stepping into a forgotten part of his childhood. Eleanor answered the door with cautious curiosity. She was now in her early 80s, tall and thin, her silver hair pulled back into a loose braid. Her posture was still straight, her presence commanding yet warm. "James Sullivan," she said, her voice deep with recognition. "Margaret's grandson." "Yes, ma'am. I need your help." He explained everything: Margaret's suspicions, the funeral, the barking dogs, and the documents he'd found. Eleanor listened silently, her expression grave. When he finished, she took the ledger from his hand and studied it for a long while. "I always feared this day might come," she whispered. Margaret wasn't paranoid. She was persistent. And Father Thomas was always too interested in the church's finances for a man of God. She disappeared into her study and returned with a dusty leather notebook. Inside were records donations she and Margaret had logged together years ago for transparency. They didn't match the ones in the restricted log, not even close. James sat back, stunned. "So it's real?" Eleanor nodded. "And we can prove it. But we'll need someone with access, someone inside the church who hasn't turned blind." James remembered Rebecca Clay, the secretary who had risked approaching him. Maybe she could help. He looked down at Max, who was already staring toward the door, ears twitching. "Then we go home," James said. "It's time to bring this into the light." Chapter 4. The tension breaks. The wind over Green Hill had grown colder in the past 2 days. The skies more restless, as though the town itself sensed the storm about to break. James stood beneath the old oak tree near the church's south entrance, a folder of evidence clutched tight under his coat. The leaves above whispered, stirring restlessly in the dusk air, and Max sat at his side, motionless but watchful. Every footstep, every car door from the nearby street made the golden retriever tense. James hadn't slept since returning from Eleanor Grayson's house. She had armed him with decades-old donation records that didn't match the church's current ledgers. Between her book and Margaret's findings, the truth was undeniable. But truth, James knew, was only power when someone was brave enough to speak it and survive the backlash. Behind them, the sturdy footsteps of Mary Walters approached. She wore her usual gray wool coat buttoned to her chin, and her hair, though pinned, neatly danced slightly in the wind. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, met James's. "He knows you have something," she said plainly. "And if I know men like Thomas, he won't let you walk in and hand it over." James gave a weary nod. "I think he's already planning his move." He was right. Elsewhere inside the rectory, Father Thomas stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his collar with trembling fingers. He was no longer the stoic figure who commanded Sunday mornings with scripture. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, and a nervous tic twitched beneath his left eye. He had spent the night shredding documents, hiding ledgers, and sending anonymous calls. Calls to friends, allies, anyone still loyal. People like Calvin. Calvin Brooks was the church's groundskeeper. In his early 50s, thick-set with broad shoulders and a heavy limp from a motorcycle accident in his youth, Calvin was loyal to a fault. He didn't talk much, kept mostly to himself, and was fiercely protective of the church's traditions. His weather-beaten hands had planted every flower around the church courtyard for the last 20 years. To him, Father Thomas was not a suspect. He was a symbol of order in a world that no longer respected sanctity. That night, under the excuse of checking the electricals, Calvin was waiting near the church's back stairs, where he had been told James might be snooping. What he hadn't been told was why. James, unaware of the trap, decided it was time to confront the source. With Mary beside him and Max alert, they stepped into the church just after the bell struck 7. The air inside was still thick with old incense and something else tension. Rebecca Clay had agreed earlier in the day to leave the vestry door unlocked, a quiet act of rebellion against the priest she had grown afraid of. They moved quickly, guided by Max, who paused at certain doorways, sniffed at corners, and finally led them past the confessional booths and down the left hallway. James opened the vestry door and entered first. Inside was a room lined with dusty robes and old sacramental supplies. But one thing stood out, an old wooden panel on the wall slightly ajar. Behind it, a small safe. Mary's breath caught. Before they could reach it, footsteps thundered down the stairs. "Hey!" Calvin's voice bellowed as he stormed into the room, flashlight raised like a club. James turned startled, raising his hands. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." "You don't belong back here," Calvin shouted. Mary stepped forward. "Calvin, listen. We know this looks strange, but James is telling the truth. Father Thomas has been stealing from the community." Margaret found proof. Calvin hesitated for only a second before advancing again. Then came the growl, deep, forceful, and protective. "Rex." The German shepherd had slipped in behind them unnoticed, having tracked James's scent. Now he stood between Calvin and James, his body tense, eyes locked. Calvin froze his grip on the flashlight, loosening. For a moment no one moved. "Call him off," Calvin whispered. "No," said James. "Not until you hear what we found." But the moment passed too quickly. Calvin lunged forward anyway, driven by fear more than duty. The flashlight swung toward James's head, and then everything happened at once. Rex leapt, intercepting the blow midair and knocking Calvin to the ground. Max barked behind them, high and sharp. James stumbled back, barely catching his balance, while Mary rushed to shield the evidence. Calvin groaned beneath Rex's weight, the flashlight rolling across the floor. James knelt beside him. "You were loyal to the wrong man." Minutes later, once Calvin had been calmed and escorted outside, Mary helped James pry open the safe behind the vestry panel. Inside were envelopes, many thick with cash, and a second ledger, this one with darker markings, names, and numbers coded in abbreviations. James photographed every page. Later in the sanctuary, Max wandered to the altar, sniffing persistently along the base. Mary followed him and noticed something unusual, a seam in the floor panel beneath the pulpit. They called James over. Together they pulled the section up to reveal a narrow crawlspace with a small lockbox tucked beneath. Inside were transfer receipts, routing numbers, and several IDs not belonging to anyone from Green Hill. Mary's hands trembled as she lifted a final photo. Father Thomas standing beside a man whose face was familiar. Henry Whitmore, the landowner, whose death had always seemed too sudden. "This goes deeper than we thought," Mary whispered. And now James added, "We have enough to bring it into the light." Chapter 5. Truth and the New Dawn. The morning sun broke over Green Hill like a soft exhale, golden light spilling across the rooftops and church steeple as though nature itself had been holding its breath for this moment. For the first time in days, the sky was clear, no mist, no rain, only a clean stillness that seemed to acknowledge what was about to happen. James stood just outside the front steps of St. Peter's Church, folder in hand, Max and Rex flanking him like guardians on either side. Both dogs were calm but alert, their eyes scanning the gathering crowd with quiet intelligence. Mary stood nearby, her cane anchored firmly in the gravel. Her shawl fluttered slightly in the breeze, and though her age weighed on her body, her spirit stood as strong as ever. Word had spread quickly after last night's discovery. Rebecca Clay, no longer afraid, had contacted the town sheriff, and townspeople, many of whom had donated to the church for decades, had begun to gather. Some held their Sunday hats in their hands. Others clutched rosaries. All were waiting, confused but present. Inside the church, Father Thomas stood alone at the altar. The early light slanted through the stained-glass windows and cast fractured colors across his face, making him look older, more worn. His eyes, once calculating, now flickered with fatigue and resignation. For years he had played his role flawlessly. Sermons, sacraments, smiles. But truth had slipped through the cracks, carried on the paws of dogs and the eyes of those who still believed in justice. The doors creaked open. James entered first, followed by Mary and Rebecca. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s named Howard Lang, stepped in behind them. Sheriff Lang had a weathered, no-nonsense face, with steel-gray hair and the steady gait of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when something didn't smell right. He'd served in Green Hill for nearly 30 years, and though he was usually slow to judge, the evidence laid before him last night had silenced even his doubts. Father Thomas James said evenly, stopping in front of the pews. "The time for silence is over." The priest looked up. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he stepped down slowly from the altar, hands trembling. "You don't understand, James." "None of you do. I understand enough," James replied. Margaret knew. She wrote it down. "We found the documents. The safe, the ledger with those names, and now the people you stole from people who trusted you are here to listen." Behind James, the townsfolk were filtering in. Mary had invited them one by one, not with anger, but with care. Among them was Alice Green, the baker, with a round, gentle face and eyes that always looked tired from too many early mornings. Her family had donated to the church for decades. Next came Thomas and Nina Parks, retired teachers, whose savings had partly funded the stained glass restoration 5 years ago. One by one they filled the pews, not with hatred, but with a hunger for truth. Rebecca stepped forward, holding the coded ledger. "I trusted you," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You told me it was God's work, but it was your own pocket you were filling." Father Thomas dropped his eyes. "It started small, just a few funds, emergency repairs, and then it spiraled. People gave so freely they never asked questions." James nodded. "But Margaret did. And when she got too close, I didn't hurt her." Father Thomas's voice cracked. "I swear it. She died peacefully. But yes, I was relieved. Because I knew she had enough to ruin everything." "You did that yourself," said Sheriff Lang. He stepped forward and read him his rights with a calm firmness. Thomas didn't resist. As the sheriff placed cuffs gently around his wrists, a quiet murmur spread through the congregation, shock, sorrow, and a strange sense of release. It was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. Outside, Max and Rex waited patiently by the stone steps. As Father Thomas was led out, his eyes briefly met Max's. Whatever he saw there, judgment maybe, or understanding, made him look away. The sheriff's car disappeared down the road and silence returned to the courtyard. For a moment no one moved. Then slowly, people began turning to James. "What now?" someone asked. James looked around, the folder still under his arm. "We begin again. This town was built on trust. Margaret believed in that. So did Eleanor. So did many of you. It's time we return to it." Mary stepped beside him. "We'll need someone to look after the old library again," she added, her tone casual but pointed. "Since Margaret's gone." Alice Green smiled faintly. "I think we know the right man for that." And so weeks later, James accepted the position Margaret once held, community librarian, caretaker of records, and quiet heart of the town. The library was a small brick building nestled behind the post office, filled with dust and stories and more history than anyone realized. He spent his days restoring it, cataloging Margaret's personal notes, and welcoming children eager to read about faraway places and brave creatures. Max often lay beside the fireplace, tail thumping every time a visitor entered. Rex visited often too, usually with Jim or Mary, and would sit watchfully near the doorway like a sentinel. The townspeople, once skeptical of their instincts, now greeted them as heroes, sometimes bringing treats, other times simply offering a nod of respect. One late afternoon, James stepped outside the library to find Max and Rex playing in the golden grass beneath the sycamores. The light caught their fur glinting like crowns. He watched them for a moment, one bounding with joy, the other steady and watchful. In that quiet scene, James saw everything Margaret had fought to preserve: love, loyalty, and the simple power of truth spoken, not shouted. He stepped back inside, heart lighter, knowing that even in the darkest chapters there's always a page that turns toward the light. In the quiet moments of life, truth often speaks not through loud voices, but through loyalty, intuition, and quiet courage. Sometimes it comes in the bark of a faithful dog, in the watchful eyes of a friend, or in the strength of a community that refuses to turn away. Max and Rex reminded us that heroes come in many forms, and that love, when guided by truth, can shine through even the darkest shadows. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who still believes in goodness. Leave a comment below to tell us what this journey meant to you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that celebrate love, justice, and the quiet miracles around us. And if you believe God guided Max and Rex to reveal the truth, comment Amen to bless all those who protect us in silence. May He watch over you and your loved ones now and always.